The clock on the nightstand read 4:47 a.m. when Bruce Lee's eyes snapped open, not from his usual pre-dawn discipline, not from the internal alarm clock that had guided him through decades of training. This was different. His heart was pounding, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool Hong Kong morning air drifting through the bedroom window. The nightmare had felt so real. In his dream, he was 8 years old again, standing in the courtyard of their family home. His father, Li Hoi Chuen, was teaching him the fundamentals of Wing Chun. But in the dream, his father's face kept fading, becoming translucent, until Bruce was throwing punches at nothing but empty air. Even the dragon cannot fight what he cannot see, his father's voice had whispered before disappearing completely. Bruce sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair. Beside him, Linda stirred but didn't wake. Her breathing was soft and rhythmic, peaceful. He envied that peace. At 32, Bruce Lee was at the pinnacle of his career. Hollywood was calling. His philosophy was spreading worldwide. He was becoming everything he'd dreamed of. So why did he feel so lost? A sound from down the hallway made him freeze. A soft whimper, then a cry. Brandon, his 8-month-old son, was awake. Bruce slipped out of bed quietly, his bare feet padding across the cold hardwood floor. The hallway was dimly lit by the street lamps outside, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with each step he took toward the nursery. Brandon's cries grew louder as Bruce approached. Not the urgent wails of hunger or discomfort, but something else. Something that tugged at Bruce's chest in a way he couldn't explain. He pushed open the nursery door and found Brandon standing in his crib, tiny hands gripping the rails, tears streaming down his cherubic face. The moment their eyes met, the baby's cries intensified. "Hey, little warrior," Bruce whispered, reaching down to lift his son. "What's got you so upset?" Brandon's small body trembled against Bruce's chest. The baby's vulnerability hit him like a physical blow. This tiny human, completely dependent on him, completely trusting him to keep the world's darkness at bay. Bruce carried Brandon to the rocking chair by the window. The Hong Kong skyline stretched out before them, a mixture of ancient tradition and modern ambition, much like Bruce himself. "You know something, little one," Bruce said softly, settling into the chair with Brandon cradled against him. "Sometimes your old man has nightmares too." Brandon's crying had subsided to occasional sniffles. His dark eyes, so much like Bruce's own, stared up with that intense focus only babies possess. "I dreamed about my father tonight," Bruce continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's been gone for so long, but in my dreams, he's still teaching me, still trying to show me the way." The rocking chair creaked gently as Bruce began a slow, soothing rhythm. Outside, Hong Kong was beginning to stir. The faint sounds of early morning vendors preparing for the day drifted through the window. "You want to know a secret?" Bruce said, looking down at his son. "Everyone thinks your daddy is fearless. They see the movies, the demonstrations, the confidence. But right now, holding you, I'm more scared than I've ever been." Brandon made a small sound, his tiny hand reaching up to touch Bruce's face. "It's true." Bruce smiled sadly. "In the dojo, I know exactly who I am. I know every move, every counter, every breath. But here, as your father, I'm completely lost." Bruce shifted Brandon to one arm and reached for a small wooden toy on the nearby shelf. It was carved in the shape of a dragon, painted in vibrant reds and golds. His own father had given it to him when he was barely older than Brandon was now. "My father gave me this," Bruce said, holding the dragon where Brandon could see it. "He told me that the dragon represents strength, wisdom, and protection. But you know what he never told me? How terrifying it is to be responsible for someone else's strength, someone else's wisdom." Brandon's small fingers wrapped around the dragon's tail. And for a moment, Bruce felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with martial arts or philosophy or fame. "I've spent my whole life perfecting my body, my mind, my spirit," Bruce continued. "But nothing prepared me for this. Nothing prepared me for loving someone so much that it physically hurts." The baby gurgled softly, and Bruce could swear he saw understanding in those dark eyes. "In the ring, in the movies, I'm supposed to be invincible, the legend, the master. But here's what they don't tell you about being a master, Brandon. The real fight isn't with other people. It's not even with yourself. It's with time." Bruce's voice caught slightly. "Time that moves too fast. Time that takes away the people we love. Time that makes us realize how little we actually control." He stood up and walked to the window, Brandon still secure in his arms. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. "Your grandfather would have loved you," Bruce said, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "He would have taught you things I never learned. About patience, about being present, about finding strength in stillness instead of always moving." Brandon yawned, his small body relaxing further into Bruce's embrace. "You know what the hardest part is?" Bruce asked, more to himself than to his son. "Everyone expects me to have all the answers. They come to me for wisdom, for guidance, for strength. But right now, holding you, I realize how many questions I still have." He began to sway gently, an unconscious movement that seemed to soothe them both. "What if I fail you? What if all this philosophy, all this training, doesn't make me a good father? What if being Bruce Lee gets in the way of just being Daddy?" The questions hung in the air like incense in a temple. "In Chinese tradition," Bruce said softly, "fathers are supposed to pass down their wisdom to their sons. But what do you do when you realize your wisdom is still incomplete, when you're still learning who you are?" He carried Brandon back to the rocking chair and settled in again. The baby's breathing had become deep and regular, but his eyes remained open, watching his father with that unwavering infant intensity. "I guess that's the real lesson," Bruce realized, speaking as much to himself as to Brandon. "Being a master isn't about having all the answers. It's about being brave enough to keep asking questions, even when those questions scare you." He reached for a small book of Chinese poetry on the side table. It had belonged to his father, pages yellowed with age and countless readings. "Let me tell you something my father used to tell me," Bruce said, opening the book to a familiar passage. "He said that the strongest tree is not the one that never bends, but the one that can bend without breaking." Bruce began to recite a Chinese lullaby his own father had sung to him decades ago. His voice was soft but strong, the ancient words carrying the weight of generations. "Mo li hua, man yuan xiang wei mei ru hua." As he sang, something profound happened. The fear that had been gripping his chest began to loosen. The weight of expectation, of having to be perfect, began to lift. "You know what I just figured out?" Bruce whispered as the lullaby ended. "Fighting isn't always about striking. Sometimes it's about yielding. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you don't have all the answers." Brandon's eyes were beginning to close, but he fought sleep as if he didn't want to miss a moment with his father. "I may not know how to be the perfect father," Bruce continued, "but I know how to love you with everything I have. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's where real strength comes from." The sun was fully up now, casting warm light across the nursery. In the distance, Bruce could hear Linda stirring in their bedroom. "Here's what I promise you, little warrior," Bruce said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I may not be able to fight time, but I'll make every moment count. I may not have all my father's wisdom yet, but I'll share what I have and learn the rest alongside you." He stood up and carried Brandon back to the crib, but the baby's small hand clutched at Bruce's shirt, as if reluctant to let go. "I know, buddy. I don't want to let go either." Bruce leaned down and kissed Brandon's forehead gently. "But here's what I've learned this morning. Real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. And it's about knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help." As he placed Brandon in the crib, the baby finally succumbed to sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully. Bruce stood there for a long moment, watching his son sleep. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt less like weakness and more like responsibility, purpose. "Thank you," he whispered to the sleeping child, "for reminding me that being human isn't something to fight against. It's something to embrace." He turned off the small nightlight and headed toward the door, but paused at the threshold. The dragon toy lay forgotten on the floor, where Brandon had dropped it. Bruce picked it up and placed it on the dresser, where his son could see it when he woke up. As he walked back down the hallway, Bruce felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of a resolved fight or a perfected technique, but the peace of acceptance. The real battle wasn't in any dojo. It was here, in the quiet moments between father and son, in the willingness to be vulnerable, in the courage to love completely, even when that love scared you more than any opponent ever could. Back in his bedroom, Linda was awake, watching him with knowing eyes. She had been married to Bruce long enough to recognize the signs of his internal battles, the moments when the world-famous fighter grappled with something beyond physical combat. "How is he?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the gentle concern of a mother and the wisdom of a woman who had learned to love a legend without losing sight of the man beneath. Bruce sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders carrying a different kind of weight than they had when he'd left the room an hour before. "Perfect," he replied, and for the first time that morning, he meant it completely. "We're both perfect, even with all our imperfections." Linda reached over and took his hand. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the present moment. "You look different," she observed, "lighter somehow." Bruce turned to face her, and in the growing morning light, she could see that something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The constant tension that usually lived behind his eyes had softened. "I've been carrying something I didn't even realize," Bruce said slowly. "This weight of having to be perfect, of having to have all the answers. But holding our son, watching him trust me completely, despite my uncertainties, it made me understand something." He paused, gathering his thoughts like he was preparing for a particularly complex martial arts form. "My father died when I was so young," Bruce continued. "I've spent years trying to live up to what I thought he wanted me to become. The perfect son, the perfect student, the perfect master. But tonight, with Brandon, I realized something profound. My father wasn't perfect either. He was just a man trying his best to love his son." Linda squeezed his hand gently. "And that's enough?" "That's everything," Bruce said with quiet conviction. "The real strength isn't in being invulnerable. It's in being vulnerable and choosing to love anyway." As Bruce climbed back into bed, he realized that this morning had taught him something no martial arts master had ever shown him. The ancient philosophers spoke of water being the strongest element because it could adapt to any container, flow around any obstacle, but they had never mentioned this, that the most powerful force in the universe might just be a father's love for his child. He settled beside Linda, and for the first time in months, his mind wasn't racing through techniques or philosophies or the demands of his career. Instead, it was filled with the image of Brandon's trusting eyes and the sound of his own voice singing an ancient lullaby in the quiet darkness of early morning. "Bruce?" Linda whispered as he closed his eyes. "Yes, you're going to be an amazing father. You already are." In the growing light of dawn, Bruce Lee smiled,